because of issues with Zoom on Linux. I am using audio device on one computer and screen sharing and so forth on another. So I hope this works as well as it should. It does mean I'm going to be a little, it's going to be hard for me to see the chat. So maybe somebody will flag questions as they come up. I'm delighted to take questions as they happen, though. I don't necessarily want to just do a stream of consciousness, 60 or 90-minute talk here. I'd love it if folks have questions so we can jump right to them. All right, so I would like to share my screen. Looks like I have that ability. All right. So let's see, how's the best way to do this? So I guess where I would like to start is to sort of take a step back and look at what is Docker, why did we think it was a good idea to use it for Islandora, and why institutions that are adopting Islandora might decide to adopt Docker as their way of deployment. So sort of as a background to this, in prior iterations, really the expectation for Islandora was that you would have a single server or a couple of servers, and you would go in and manually install software on them for all the dependencies that Islandora needs. And anybody who's maintained one, if not multiple instances of Islandora knows how cumbersome that can be. So when Docker started emerging, I don't know, 4 or 5 years ago, we started talking about doing this. And ultimately there was a project called Isle, which I'll go into, that was part of sort of the Islandora 7 ecosystem for the last 2.5, maybe 3 years of Islandora 7. And now that same concept has been carried over for Islandora 8 and is currently, I would say, sort of the predominant distribution or installation method for Islandora. I know there are still institutions that are uncomfortable with Docker, and I'll touch on that a little bit here. But part of my objective here is to provide a little bit of a window into Docker itself, not just jump straight to Isle, which is how you run Islandora in Docker, and therefore maybe with folks having a better understanding of the underpinnings of Isle, there might be a little bit more comfort with those who are still uncomfortable with it for adoption. And I think those who are using it in a variety of manners. So what I'm going to describe here is not the only way you can do any of these things. And part of the community that we all enjoy being part of is understanding how other people are using the same software and seeing it in code in many instances and swapping tips and tricks. So Docker and Isle are pretty opinionated, but they do leave you a lot of flexibility as well. And I hope I'll be able to touch on that in a useful way in this presentation. All right, so what I'm going to go over is what is Docker? Why would you want to use Docker? Why would you not want to use Docker? And then we'll talk about Isle a bit. So there are now 3 repositories that you might be interested in understanding. There's the old legacy Islandora version of Isle, and then there are 2 repositories that correspond to the Islandora 8 or 2.0 version of Islandora. And then at the very end, we'll touch on Kubernetes and sort of like managing and maintaining a Islandora cluster. And then if folks are interested, I think we'll need to have a separate session to really go through Isle in detail. right? So the objective of this presentation is sort of to get you comfortable and familiar with the concepts behind ISLE. And by the end, I will do a little demo somewhere about 15 minutes before the end. We'll start up a build in the background. And then by the time we're done with the slides, it'll be done building. And then we can go and click around the site and see how it is. Okay. So as I said, let's start with the basics. So what is Docker? Well, Docker is a containerization system. And if you're familiar with virtual machines, this is not a new concept for you. What's really different between virtual machines and Docker containers is that a virtual machine essentially has the full operating system installed and running on it. So, so there's quite a lot of overhead if you want to run a whole bunch of machines. If you've ever tried to run a bunch of the old OVAs at once, you know what I mean. Whereas with Docker, each of the little containers really is a single service. So you have a Drupal container and a IIIF container and a Fedora container and whatnot, and each one of those is running a major process. There are ways to have Docker containers run a couple of processes, and we do use them in ISLE, but conceptually, really, they're really running, each container exists to run one main process. And the mechanism for doing this is called actually, I'm not going to jump into that. Okay, so then if you think about virtual machines, right, one of the things you have to define is how do you persist data. The same is true for Docker. And by default, if you have a container that doesn't have persistent data storage defined, you turn on the container, it runs and does something. Like, for example, the fit service, you want to be like this. It just runs. And if you send a request to it, it'll do something with it and return it to you. But it doesn't store any state, right? It's just a pass-through call and response service. You shut it down, you turn it on. It doesn't need to remember what it did last because it processed those requests. Whereas something like Fedora or a database, obviously you would want to persist the data. You send it some data, you want it to store it. And then if you turn off all the virtual machines and turn them on, you really expect that data is still there. So there are two ways of doing that in Docker. One is called a Docker volume, and the other is called a bind mount. And there are some intricate differences between them, but really the basic difference is Docker volumes are kind of hidden from you. They're stored like in a hidden location on your hard disk. You don't have to worry about file permissions or anything like that because you're not trying to access them from your host machine. But that's the difference, right? You can't access them from your host machine. Whereas a bind mount is a folder or a file on your host machine, the computer you're running this from, that is shared, like mirrored into the running VM, the running Docker container. And it can be shared into multiple, right? So if you have like, I don't know, a certificate that needs to be on multiple containers, you just bind mount that same certificate into multiple containers all at once. They can all share the same file. Another big advantage here is that you really don't have to do everything by yourself. So by this point in the open source software ecosystem, practically anything you would want to run, unless you're building that software yourself, is available to you as a Docker container. And the thing about the Islandora project is it is software we're building ourselves, right? So we had to build those containers ourselves, and that's where the ISLE project came from. The other great thing about this is the Docker containers are built essentially with basic system administration commands. They're very legible for any sort of a systems administrator. And so you can pick up one of these things called a Docker file and look at it yourself, understand exactly what's going on, and then you can actually modify it. You can actually take it and modify it, or you can extend it. You can take the output of somebody else's creation and say, all right, start with that, and now I'm going to run a couple other, apt-get installs or move some files around or, bind mount something else in. So the concepts here are that you have the Docker client that runs on your machine, and you can do things like build containers or build images rather. You can pull images from a registry, which is simply a remote registry. There's something called Docker Hub, which is the easiest way to think about this. It's like GitHub, but instead of storing source code, it stores Docker images. So the Islandora Foundation, for example, builds the quote unquote official images for the Islandora microservices and so forth, and pushes to Docker Hub. And if you say, give me Islandora/fits, it will go and fetch from Docker Hub the Islandora/fits image for you to be able to run on your own machine. So yeah, as I was saying, these are pretty legible. So this is an example Docker file. This one is the Postgres image. Now you can imagine there's already a Postgres image out there, right? The Postgres people have released a Postgres image, but for whatever reason, we decided we wanted to build our own, either to make it smaller or to do something precise with it. But this is basically all it takes to have a container that you built from scratch that runs Postgres. So see these froms. The from is where you start with somebody else's container. So this from Alpine, that's a base operating system container. And then we also pull in the base container for the ISLE repository. And then on top of that, we essentially use APK, which is the Alpine package manager, sort of like apt-get, but for Alpine, to add Postgres and Postgres client. And then we do a little bit of stuff with data management and permissions, and we set an environment variable, which is needed by the other or expected by the other services. And then we copy the contents of the file structure that created this. I will click through to that for a second. Oh, this is the actual built image. Oops. We'll look at the build kit repository in a little more detail in a minute, but I just want to pull this up. So Postgres. So see how there's this rootfs. So if you want to build files into this image, you just put them in this rootfs section, and that's what that last line does. Is it takes that folder called rootfs, which is present at build time, and it copies it to slash, the root of the container itself. All right, I'm just going to pause there for a second. Any questions?
I wonder if it might be useful, Noah, to sort of point out the difference between the community that's maintaining the Docker files versus the consuming institutions that are pulling them, in terms of the relationship between looking at these Docker files, for instance.
Sure. Yeah, that's a good question, or a good observation. So when you look at something like this on Docker Hub, right, you can see that it is Islandora / Postgres. So the first half here is the institution or the group that is making it available. So in this case, this is coming from the Islandora folks. If we were to go and look at the official Postgres image, we can do that. Just search for it. See, here's the quote unquote official one. And because it's official, there's no organization. It's sort of like the blue check mark on Twitter. But here's another one. This is a company called Bitnami that publishes like practically every high profile open source piece of software as a Docker image. So if you were to be using this in your application, you would be following Bitnami's release schedule as opposed to the Islandora Foundation's release schedule or the official image release schedule. And whatever the institution is that's doing the Docker releases gets to set their own schedule, right? The process might be automated, it might be manual. For IL7, it is manual. We do it once a month. For IL8, it is actually automated. So anytime there is a commit that is created on the system, a build goes out, and then we can tag it to make it sort of an official release anytime. I saw a hand there. I think it was Rosie.
Well, I lowered it because you just answered my question.
Outstanding.
Cool.
All right, great.
No, I
Yep.
personally wonder if it's worth mentioning, and I'm not sure if you've already said this, but like you're really giving the background here, and that if people coming in to use ISLE may never ever have to deal with this, but it's really good to have the fundamentals to start with. So in case anybody out there is like, oh my gosh, I have to do this to learn ISLE. No, you don't. But it's nice to know that if you do have to come in and do this, here's how.
Absolutely.
And then in addition to that, I think, Noah, if you could unpack what the monthly releases mean in terms of having, for ISLE7, having monthly releases of ISLE available to the community as community members. If we pull down those new images each month after the release, what's the benefit to us? Could you unpack that? Because that's like the end user perspective of, it's really easy to pull the images down. What's the benefit to us?
Sure. So if you're running a bare metal server or a virtual machine that you're just managing the host operating system on, you'll be doing package updates. And not only will you be doing package updates, but you'll be manually doing updates on things like, Tomcat and ImageMagick and so forth, things that aren't package released perhaps, or that the Islandora doesn't use the package, the current package released version. And that gets tedious, especially for larger upgrades. So you can see again this from Alpine 3.13.2. That's a version release of an operating system, right? There are Alpine releases all the time, and this very well could say from Alpine latest, and then it would automatically keep up every time there was a build with whatever the latest Alpine build was. So when the institution that you're following publishes a new image, depending on how this sort of from hierarchy is handled, you're typically getting updates all the way up the chain, right? You're getting every little component within all of these components updated, and so all you do is you swap out your containers, and you have a complete set of security updates for your images, for basically everything that runs in your system. But if there's a magic number like this, you have to be relying on the maintainers to be updating that magic number, right?
Is ISLE regularly updated? ISLE8?
ISLE8 is ISLE8 does not have a formal release cycle right now. I would say that's an issue.
But ISLE7 does.
ISLE7 does, yeah. We built it and we use it with all of our Islandora 7 clients. And so in order to do our work as a vendor, we do those releases, and the community is able to use those same ones. I anticipate something like that will happen with Islandora 8 as sites move into production, sites using ISLE move into production.
So it's kind of like we need a critical mass of people, of institutions, to be committed to ISLE8 to do this.
Yeah, that critical mass is small. Like,
yeah, okay.
We're committed to ISLE, and we'll be doing this. But and I know Lyrasis is using ISLE images to some degree, and Johns Hopkins, and like there are a number of institutions which are about to publish sites that are all relying on this. Quark will come up later on this call. And I think that's it, right? There's very few. So there are Islandora 8 sites that are in production, but I I think they were all hand built basically. And now this first wave of Dockerized systems are about to hit production. And that's when formal release schedules will be established.
So can I make one more comment there?
Yep.
I think the beauty of ISLE, what it offers is it offers institutions the ability to keep their Islandora platform, their repository, up to date in a way that's simple, or much more simple than it used to be. Because instead of before, where institutions were bound to keep all of these different modules and packages updated, and the reality is that many institutions fell behind and were way far out of date of updates, which left their systems vulnerable. Now, simply pulling down, doing a Docker pull, pulls down all of the images, and you have the ability to then test that on your staging server. And if it looks good and it works, then you push it to your production. And then all of a sudden, your Tomcat and your MySQL database have all been upgraded to the latest version, so there aren't security vulnerabilities for your platform. And it's a common platform that we share.
Thanks, David. Rosie?
So I don't know if this is the right time to ask this, but I'm not clear on what you still need to update yourself, because as
Sure.
I understand, you can update like the user-facing things to an Islandora user include your Drupal version, your Drupal module version, the security updates that go into there. You know, even things like Drush, if you can even run, is Drush a thing in ISLE? And so, yeah, is there still like what is still required for like to get manual updates?
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, so I'm going to skip ahead to this slide, which is about maintenance with ISLE. So Rosie, you're absolutely right? And in my mind, I separate this into three categories. When you're using ISLE or Docker in general, there are three things that you're still updating. There is the host server, which is the actual or virtual machine that Docker is running on. That is still a normal server, unless you're using like Elastic Container Service or something like that, and that needs apt-get or yum updates, right? But there's not that much installed on it. It's like the base OS and Docker and Git and I don't know. The list we have is like 10 or 12 things. It's really not much, and they're all package managed. So that's easy. Then there's Islandora dependencies, which I would say is close to 100% covered by ISLE out of the box. And if it's not covered by ISLE out of the box, then you as an institution will have modified it. Like you'll have your own version of the Fits container if you need to modify how Fits behaves. That's like a level 2 sort of conversation, and I would advise we sort of come back to that in a bit. But that's one thing, right? So ISLE provides an updated version of all of those services, so you can count on everything in this diagram as being covered by ISLE, right? There is a Houdini image and a Hypercube image and a Homerus image, etc. And all of those things, as David said, you just Docker Compose down, Docker pull to get the new images, Docker Compose up, bring your system back up, and you've got all of the latest. And sometimes there's a little bit you have to do if there were backwards incompatible changes that happened in there. Like for example, if you moved from Fedora 5 to Fedora 6, you'd have to, rake your data a little bit. But that, you would know about that. That would not be just a point security release sort of a thing. And then the third category is your Drupal application. Oh, one more, because you mentioned Drush. I put Drush in the second bullet. Drush is built in to the Drupal container, right? So that's something that's just there when you spin up the Drupal container, unless you have packed a different version of Drush into your application, which Drupal allows. But anyway, so the third category is your Drupal application. You still do need to do module updates and whatnot inside of your Drupal application. So it's not the same thing. It's not like ISLE replaces the Islandora code base, but rather your Islandora code base is embedded inside of it. It is bind mounted in to the Drupal container. If I go back to this, right? Your application lives here, and everything else essentially you can take out of the box from the Islandora Foundation. You never have to worry about installing any of these things by hand again or updating them. All you have to do is treat this like it's a pure Drupal application and just update Drupal using Composer. And like, so that, you know, as a vendor that runs a bunch of different sites, like that's what makes all of this feasible, that we don't have to have somebody whose job is just, you know, maintenance 24/7, right?
It also means, Rosie, that because your Islandora code base, your Drupal is bind mounted, and correct me now if I'm phrasing this incorrectly, because it's bind mounted, you can make customizations so that your institution's Islandora is running differently than our institutions or than some other institutions.
Right.
And they all persist because that's bind mounted and sort of slurped or mirrored into the ISLE container that uses that code. So if you want to install a new module, you'll do that on your bind mount, and you'll do it there, and then it will live forever, so that you can keep pulling down new Docker images and even new Drupal Docker images, but it won't affect the customized code that you have on your side.
Yeah, I'll do a better job, or I'll illustrate what David is saying. See this is the ISLE DC project, and that's the thing you get from the foundation. We'll talk about the structure of this a little bit in a minute, but there is this code base folder, and in ISLE 7, actually, we had this just be an empty folder that's like a Git submodule that has a totally different code base where you store this. We actually found, again, in the process of managing a whole bunch of these, that keeping two repositories in sync, a ISLE repository and an Islandora repository, was unnecessarily complex, and it just tripped you up more than it helped you. So in Islandora 8, we've actually gone with a single repository that has both the ISLE/Docker Compose code and the code base all checked into one repository, and then it's always perfectly in sync, and things are actually a lot simpler. But yeah, Rosie, this is just a Drupal app with a Composer file, etc. in here, and you can do anything to that you could to any other Drupal app.
So sorry, just a follow-up question.
Mhm.
When you said that they're in sync, was that just a like logistical managing thing, or are there
Yeah.
actually dependencies that happen between the stuff in the code base folder and your other Docker containers?
Sure. Okay, so for example, imagine you wanted to add riprap as a thing to your Islandora application. I would say that there's two things you would do. One is you would run Composer require. Where's my modules here?
So you'd need to get the Drupal module for it, but you'd also need to have the service, which is a separate container. And so
That's right.
if you have one, but if your Drupal thinks it's got one, but it doesn't, then you're in trouble. Yeah.
Yeah, so exactly. So you would do Composer require, Mark Jordan /riprap or whatever it is, and it would put a line here, and your Drupal application would have it. But also you would have to go out and we'll look at this Docker Compose file and see how here's like crayfits. There is a little block like this that says riprap, blah, 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 that you can put in here to include the riprap service. And then looking at the this diagram, it would essentially have another little box that was called riprap, that was a service that's available to the Drupal container. And then Drupal's riprap module would have the dependency it needs with that service.
Great, thanks.
Yep. And if you want to throw something out, like imagine you don't want to use Fedora, right? You just go into that Docker Compose file and you delete the Fedora and recast services, right? Boom, gone. You don't ever have to think about them again, right? You may have to change your Drupal application to not try to send things there, but adding and removing services is just that easy. So I've said a few things in the last couple minutes that I haven't explained yet. One of them is Docker Compose. Docker Compose is the simplest, in my mind, the sort of the entry level Docker orchestration tool. Some people would argue it's not really even an orchestration tool, but I think that it deserves to be thought of as one, because what it does is it prevents you from having to run Docker commands on your command line to manage Docker services. What you get to do is set up a file like I was just showing you that defines all of your Docker services and the things about them that matter, like what port they run on, and some things like here's the PHP memory limit and so forth. So you can pass in variables, and then you can save this file in your Git repo. And then every time you start up your system, it'll be exactly identical from an infrastructure configuration standpoint. And you can totally just nuke things and start them up again, and it will build all of the same container configuration. You don't have to spend any time really doing DevOps or systems administration things. You just put your configuration in here, and then you can turn things on and off. The big asterisk on that again is how the data is persisted, and in this case we're using Docker volumes. So it's all sort of hidden from us, but we could switch this over to have, the Fedora data, the OCFL, data root, for example, mounted in plain sight on your server. Well, you'd probably want to do that in a remote environment. But in terms of kicking the tires on Islandora 8, that's not really that necessary. So it comes down to use case, how that is done. As I said, this has been around for, I don't know, exactly 3 to 5 years or something, but originally Docker itself had this concept of Docker Swarm, which Docker Swarm as a separate idea does not exist anymore. This was Docker's business plan for a while, was to have Docker and Docker Compose be free, and then Docker Swarm was this paid service that was supposed to keep them in business, essentially, because enterprise use would require a heavier level of orchestration. Well, Google came along and built this thing called Kubernetes, which was so much better than Docker Swarm that they had to abandon that as a business model because everybody was using Kubernetes. But what they did do, which is really nice, is they took some of the like level 2 mechanics, like simple auto scaling and whatnot, and they added those features to Docker Compose. So you can use Docker Compose to do some of the things that you hear about when you hear people talk about Docker and Kubernetes in terms of auto scaling. So you can say, all right, if I'm running a whole bunch of video, allow more microservices to spin themselves up for video processing, and then turn them off when we're not asking for many service calls there anymore. If you really want to do that sort of thing and you want to do it well, then you need to use Kubernetes. That's what Kubernetes was built for. It allows things like they call blue-green deployments, which means when you deploy things to a server, there's no downtime. Like your old stuff, your old containers are up and they sort of mesh like a transmission with your new containers, and the old ones phase out and die off, and the new ones start picking up requests and they come in. And like this is how Netflix, for example, never goes offline, because they have this big giant blue-green deployment system that they've built. And every other website that you can think of now has blue-green deployments like this. And you can do it too if you use something like Kubernetes. But there is a tremendous learning curve with Kubernetes. Like it is so powerful, but there's also a big learning curve. So I would say that's sort of like a level 3, level 4, level 5 kind of a thing with Docker. It is possible to run Islandora well with Docker without these. Okay, so why would you want to use Docker? Right, we covered some of this already. The modularity of it makes it really agile. You can spin things up on any server at any time and get sort of the same representation. You can throw away physical servers, especially if the storage is detachable, and then spin up a new server, remount that same persistent data and be back online in 15 minutes or less. It's really kind of magical like that. You can also spin up local development environments really quickly, because really all you, and it doesn't impact anything else you're doing on your machine because everything is containerized, which means it doesn't try to change your host operating system. It runs within these little containers, and they go on and off when you say, and they don't overlap with the underlying operating system. As you can see from the Docker Compose file, things are consistent if you check them into Git, and then you are able to have pretty good replicability. And it's fast. It's not fast like execution speed is faster. It's fast like you can do server builds and server deployments and whatnot in a much faster, in a much less amount of time, and typically with less room for human error. And then one final note on this is, let's say you have a team that sometimes runs Windows and sometimes runs Linux and sometimes runs Mac. Because Docker has a platform for each of those, and you can run Docker containers in each of those environments, as long as the team that built the Docker containers sort of had this in mind, this interoperability, you can do that without a problem. And the ISLE project has been tested in all of these environments. And even more so, Nigel made sure that the new ISLE containers run very nicely on ARM chips as well. So you can use cheaper cloud machines, you can use the new Apple M1, M2, etc. And that's really nice. I alluded to the scalability also. So as I said, rather than having one single monolithic server, you can actually have those the different services running from different host machines if you want. You could have all of your Houdini services running from a separate place. You could have your database server in a totally different location. You can have multiple Drupal webheads responding to requests. You don't have to just have a single one of each of those boxes, and you can have it sort of scale up and down depending on need. All of those things take a little bit of work to do, and they're not part of the starter pack from ISLE, but I would anticipate that there will be contributions back of examples, at least of Islandora auto-scaling in the next 6 months or a year. And there are plenty of examples out there of other services that you could use if you wanted that before then. So one of the knocks against Docker is security. And I'll talk about that in a minute. There are fundamental flaws in terms of because there is a shared layer of an OS. If your server is compromised, the compromising agent can access any of the containers on the server, right? But that's not really any more dangerous than running multiple VMs on the same machine for the same reason. So I would say really look at what your security needs are, what the potential vulnerabilities are, and then look at the gains that you can make with adopting Docker. Typically, folks who are citing Docker's security risks are thinking about applications that require a much higher grade level of security review than Islandora systems, medical records and so forth. And Docker does provide really nice security tooling within its constructs. So if you've made peace with the nature of how Docker runs on the server, then you have a lot of tools to work with. You can very quickly add and manage firewalls and filters and proxies and other security tools like that. And I alluded to this earlier too. If your system is compromised, basically you can throw it all out. Make sure that those persistent data stores were not compromised, and fix them if they were, roll back to an old backup if you have to, and then just fire up a new copy. So your actual servers are very disposable, right? You just need to protect the integrity of those bind mounted data stores, and that's it. And so that's again, if we're not storing medical records and whatnot, really what you need to be protective of then is vandalism, right? You don't want somebody to come in and delete your Fedora. So you need to have a good backup. But that's sort of the worst case of a malicious intrusion. And even that is recoverable because you just restore your backup and then you spin up a new set of ISLE containers and then you mount the restored backup version and you're back up and running.
Noah, can I ask you a question?
Shoot.
In terms of security and Docker, and in your experience, all systems really need security as like a very needs to be at the front of the administrators' minds when they're putting together a system. So how does Docker compare to, like, say, if you're putting a system together, do you think that Docker in and of itself is any less secure or harder to make secure than any other system you've worked with?
No, I don't think so. I think the people who cite Docker security as a reason not to use Docker are really most often looking for a reason not to use Docker. And that's like, it's because they don't understand it or they don't want to understand it, that they'll sort of use that as a way to wave it off as a viable option. Every system has flaws, and it's just whether you're willing to manage the flaws. I'm going to come back to this in a second, just because this is a better lead in from that question. So why would you not use Docker? In my opinion, you would not use Docker if you're afraid of it. And I don't mean that in any sort of like pejorative way. I get that everybody has only so much time and energy in their lives, and they don't necessarily want to go out and learn a totally new platform, right? But that's fundamentally the reason you wouldn't use Docker. If you're in the beginning or the middle of a career, and you want to set yourself up to have a good understanding of the systems underpinnings of the next 10 or 15 years of open source development, then I think it's worth the effort to come up to speed on Docker, because Docker, or I would say containerization more than Docker, is here to stay. There are other containerization methods, and as Kubernetes came along and showed there was a better way to do swarm sort of orchestration, there will be other tools, but the concept of containerization is here to stay. And there are not forward-thinking open source projects that don't have a containerization sort of solution out there, because it is how adoption at scale is done now. And it's fine if you don't want to come online with that, but I don't think it's a waste of time or energy, because we're not going back to managing servers by hand. This is the stepping stone that will go on to the next, even further containerization sort of centric methodology of managing systems infrastructure. There are some actual drawbacks. So for example, if you are a team that has a lot of Macs in particular have a disk I/O problem in terms of reading and writing from bind mounts. There are some workarounds. They're not awesome. That's why we as a company switched over to having developers run on Linux, because we just got to sidestep that problem. Like I said, there are other side steps, and Nigel actually built one into the latest round of ISLE, which is there. He has offered. There's an IDE essentially that runs in your web browser, so nothing would be bind mounted. You get to use Docker volumes and edit things all within Docker, and that prevents this disk I/O problem, which is fundamentally between Docker and your host operating system, reading and writing to the same folder at once. So that's one like realistic consideration if you're adopting Docker and you run Macs. You need to have some mechanism for handling that. Some IT departments, like I said, just aren't interested in doing this for whatever reason, right? And it typically comes down to learning curve or staff training and whatnot. So that's another actual blocker to adoption. And I mentioned the security side of it. That's not my area of expertise. So we'll need to bring somebody in who understands that better to talk about that in more detail if folks are interested. But then the final one here, I liken this to going from functional programming to object-oriented programming. It's a different way of thinking about infrastructure management. Like object-oriented programming, it requires you to think differently, but you can tell that the concepts are not going to go away, right? This is a fundamental improvement to how systems are managed, and it's worth the time to invest in learning it because it's not going away. I see a question. Reem Max, are you saying this is a drawback when using Macs as servers or when using them as configuring command and control machines? The short answer here is I wouldn't use Macs as staging or production servers anyway. So I assume you're talking about local development servers. That is where the drawback is running a system on your local, editing it, and having that be performant. You don't want Composer install to take 5 minutes. You want it to take 30 seconds or less, right? That's what we're talking about here. So I think this was an important thing to have recognized that Islandora needed a containerization distribution method, and that managing Islandora at scale really requires something like this, especially for institutions that run, what you might have done with multi-sites in Islandora 7 or running multiple institutional repositories. What did I skip? Oh, Docker in the cloud. Okay. And then I'll pause for questions again. So if you have an institutional data center, or if you're just using virtual machines, either from Amazon or Google or anybody else, DigitalOcean, what have you, you can just do that, right? That fundamentally is not that different than running Docker on your local, right? So in AWS, that's the EC2 plus EBS plus S3 sort of, ecosystem, right? EC2 is their elastic compute platform. Those are just virtual machines. EBS is their block storage, and S3 is their sort of blob storage. And all of those, you sort of put those services together, and you can run Islandora really nicely. If you want to cut out the host server entirely, Amazon offers ECS, which is their Elastic Container Service, and then you don't have to update the host machine. You can just deploy containers straight to the cloud. EKS is their Elastic Kubernetes service, and they have other products called Fargate and Copilot, which allow you to run containers in orchestrated ways. Again, that's sort of step 2, 3, 4, 5 in the adopting Docker roadmap. But again, I don't think that you need to do anything more complicated than the first option here to do Islandora in Docker really well. And Isle demonstrates how to do it. Okay, pausing for questions. I see there's a little bit more Mac Windows commentary. Yeah, so Bethany, you run a Mac, you do Docker, Islandora in Docker development using ISLE or a fork of ISLE for Johns Hopkins every day. And it's performant enough for you to do your job, but you see other people's machines running faster.
Yes. Yeah, and we have a suite of tests that I just tend not to run locally because it constantly brings our setup down and then back up. And that can take a little bit of time. Like firing up ISLE the first time takes time, as Noah's going to show us later. Firing it up on a Mac is going to take a little bit longer. So that, yeah. So for the most part, I can work with it just fine. It's just slow around the edges.
Alexander says, where would I find a guide for a sysadmin to install and run ISLE in production? The READMEs seem geared toward evaluator, yeah, building it to see the demo. That is true. I would say that that's a gap that needs to be filled. In ISLE 7, we wrote this up in great detail. And if you're using Docker Compose in ISLE 8, the same documentation holds true to 80% or so. Like the concepts are the same, but the details are a little different. So yeah, that documentation needs to be carried over for ISLE 8. That's definitely a gap. If you read the main README and you get down a couple pages down on that main README, there is some excellent information about running it in production. I'll touch on that in a minute, but I'm actually really proposing that that be the subject of another one of these sort of 60 to 90 minute sessions in about a month at the next open meeting. Okay, so we already sort of jumped the gun on this. There is this repository that's just ICG/ISLE, and that's where you can, if you want to kick the tires on the Islandora legacy Docker infrastructure, you're welcome to do that. As I said, the documentation there is really expansive and excellent. ILDC has good documentation, but it's more on the DevOps side than on the running this in production sort of side. ILBuildKit is extremely well documented, in my opinion, also, just in terms of what services and environment variables and so forth are available for your customization. So huge kudos to Nigel for being the architect, really, of ILDC and ILBuildKit. He's done a fabulous thing with that. All right, yeah, this diagram should have been way earlier in this presentation. I think we covered it a bit. The takeaways here are that each one of these boxes is a container, and is available from the Islandora Foundation, with the exception of Drupal. That I just said that wrong. The Drupal container has an asterisk. Yes, you can use it out of the box, and it will give you sort of a default application. But really what you want to do is put your own application in there. And you do that either with a bind mount, which we'll look at when I run this demo, or when you're running in production, you would actually build yourself an image and push that to an image repository that's private. And then you would deploy that image that was pre-built to your servers. That is the short answer, Alexander, for how you run things in production. You don't want to be running Composer install on the servers. You want to run Composer install sort of in a build environment and push that pre-built image containing the output of Composer install to a private registry, container registry like Docker Hub. And then from your servers, the servers need credentials to go and talk to that private repository, pull down that image that has your application baked into it and run it. That is fundamentally the difference between Islandora 7 or ISLE 7 and ISLE 8. ISLE 7, the staging and production servers used bind mounts the same way that local development environments do. And that's fine, it works, but it's kind of a naive way of doing this. In an Islandora 8, we sort of did it right by building by following best practices and using pre-built images to run things in staging and production environments. Okay, I'm going to step back and do a little time check here. It is 11:10. I think we're going to 11:30. Okay. Let me just look ahead here. Okay, yeah, we're on track. Okay, some of this I've already talked about. You should go take a look at the ISLE BuildKit repository. There is this sort of tree structure, and so each of those little boxes in the diagram, right, has something corresponding here, and there are actually some extras. The reason there are extras is because sometimes there's an option. You can run FC Repo, really this should be called FC Repo 5 because that's what it is, and this one is FC Repo 6. And then sometimes there are things which are parent containers. So Nginx, for example, is built as an intermediate sort of layer, and then there are a couple things that are children of that. So for example, I think all of the Crayfish microservices need to run on some sort of a web service like Nginx. So they use Nginx as their base image, but so does the Drupal image, right? So I think I have Nigel's diagram here, yeah. So you can see how the hierarchy works. There's this base image, and then there's a Java image, which brings Tomcat to the mix. And then each one of these is a Tomcat application that's sort of layered on top of that. And each one of these is a PHP application that's layered on top of Nginx. And that's how BuildKit works. And the output is that each one of these sort of leaf nodes is available to you through the Docker Hub page. You could actually download the base image and Nginx and whatnot, but you wouldn't want to. There's no real purpose for those intermediate images. They're just stepping stones on the way to get to what you want, which is the leaf nodes in this graph. So as I said, the Docker Hub, there's this user Islandora, which is where the Islandora Foundation publishes images. And when we run Islandora in ISLE for Islandora 8, we don't modify any image except for the Drupal image. So we take everything else off the shelf. And for Drupal, we say start with the Islandora Foundation's Drupal image, and then composer install, and then bake that into an image and run that. Sometimes we do a little bit, we add a few packages. Like if a client needs a module that has a dependency that the broad community is not going to want, we have the ability to add that in our Docker file and not try to force the Foundation to adopt an extra dependency when we don't think that anybody else really is going to care. Another option here is what Johns Hopkins is doing, where they actually have a full fork of BuildKit, and they customized a whole bunch of things. And they run and publish all of their images to like JHU IDC/FC repo, right? They have their own org, and I don't know if it's public or private, within Docker Hub that they use as the registry where they pull their images from. And that's a totally viable option. I think Lyrasis does something similar to that as well. It's been a while since I talked to Nigel, but that's where he was headed 6 months ago. Okay, so the other Islandora DevOps repository that you should pay attention to is this ISLE-DC one. This is DC is for Docker Compose. So this is where you can like pick up the project and try it out yourself. So if you clone down the repository, you have the option of doing a number of things. You can try Islandora out. Like there's a make demo command that just gets you a demo server. That's like a clone of future.islandora.ca. There is a PR that we and Lyrasis collaborated on, which defines a install profile and theme, which is much more like the Islandora 7 user experience that we've contributed about 6 months ago and are now trying to work through the final sort of adoption phases. So this can be a good starting place for other institutions as well. And then you can also find sort of scaffolding for tooling to run in production and SSL handling. Another thing that it's useful for is very much like the old OVAs that we used to offer, the Foundation used to offer. You can spin up a set of disposable infrastructure really quick, do something and contribute it, and then shut it down and throw it away. It's very quick and easy once you know what you're doing in terms of being able to do that. But that's probably another gap, right? They're probably, I say it's easy, but that's because I know the systems, and probably there's a missing documentation page that's like, okay, so I want to contribute a PR somewhere. What are the 5 things I do to get my Docker stack up, work on it, and contribute it? All right, so what I'd like to do is I would like to hop over to my terminal for a second, and we're just going to run that installer, the Born Digital Lyrasis install profile and theme. We're going to run this in the background, and you can see how it works. Okay. So I already have this down, so I'm going to run make clean, which is just going to totally throw away everything on this computer in terms of this project. It doesn't damage any of my other projects on the computer.
No, is it possible to make the font a little bigger?
Yes.
It's legible, it's just a little small.
Control plus. Nope. There we go.
Thank you.
How's that? A little better?
Yeah.
Okay, so what we're going to do here is we're going to run make local. And because I'm on the install profile branch, which is where that PR is from, this is going to give me the Born Digital Lyrasis install profile and theme. And you can see first what it does is it goes through and generates a set of secrets. These are the passwords that you need in order to have an infrastructure set. And if we go and we look over here, we can see, for example, there's a nice long password for your Drupal database. None of these things matter, meaning like the exact values don't matter, because if you turn off your infrastructure, change a whole bunch of passwords, and then fire it up again, it will reset all the root passwords and whatnot to be the new ones that are in here. So it's very forgiving like that. And that's one of the nice security features is that the infrastructure around secrets or what Docker calls secrets, which really are passwords and tokens and things like that, private confidential information, can be changed sort of on the fly. There are secret management tools that do this in a more secure way, right? Having this password in a plain text file here maybe is not awesome, depending on what you're doing with your Git repository. And there are what's called secret management tools to get around this. Essentially, it's another thing that runs on your computer where the password is pulled from that application instead of pulling from a file on the disk. Next thing it did was it went out and it pulled the latest images for all of the different services that Docker Compose requested. And then it's spinning things up. And one of the first things it's doing is doing a Composer install with the project that it checked out. And if we go look here,
Thanks,
make
Noah.
local.
I was just going to ask if you could show the make file.
Yeah. So the heart of IL DC, I would say, is the make file. Make file does everything. It saves you from having to understand and remember all of the little intricate Docker commands, right? You just say make local, and we and Nigel and other, Danny, other collaborators have gone in and set up a script that builds you a local in the recommended way, right? There's another one here that's make up, right? This, all you have to do is say make up, and your system comes online on this computer in the recommended way. Make down turns everything off. Make login gives you a Drush ULI, to hijack the root user. There are other commands in here. Generate secrets. We saw that running at the beginning of this. There are imports and exports for FC repo data, for Drupal public and private files, for Drupal databases, Drupal configs, etc. So these are pretty well covered in the README. Alan, I see your note that make local is not working in the dev branch. It's missing the Composer JSON. Composer JSON isn't checked into this repository. So my guess is your codebase folder got corrupted somehow. And that's why it's not finding it, because that's actually pulled from another location.
That's actually on a fresh build in a fresh. I tried to scare up a brand new one, and it's the two things that it's running into is if you try to run the code examiner on that, it's missing a password which you can supply manually. But as soon as it gets to the build part, it errors out saying it's missing Compose JSON, and that's a brand new build, brand new directory.
Okay, so we'll have to look at what it's cloning into the into your code base directory. So for example, in the branch that I'm in the install profile branch, it says if you don't have a code base folder, go and start with this one, the install profile branch of the Alendora Sandbox code base. And if you do have a code base already, it'll skip that. So, if you brought in your own Drupal application from another place, then because we're going to do an install and context is broken for a certain for how Islandora uses contexts, we needed to fix this to a specific Git hash. Then it runs Composer install, then does a little bit of file permission setting, and make install will actually do the install from the Drupal file system, from the code base that's checked in there. So let's go back over here for a second. So yeah, I haven't checked out the dev branch, which is different from the install profile branch. So if you're trying this now, I definitely recommend, based on Alan's experience, running this from the install profile branch. So this is still Composer stuff. All right, Composer finishes. And now you can see it making sure that there's a database to work with. And then it's going to do this install. And that's what it's doing now, is a Drush site install. And this takes 8 or 10 minutes or something. So we're just going to let that go for a few minutes. Okay. When this is done, we'll have to do a couple things in the web browser. These would ideally be automated. We should have time to play around with that in the next couple of weeks, get that all fixed. We talked about this a little bit. If you look at the ILDC project, the things to take a look at are that make file that we just took a look through. Then there's also the sample.env file. Which, if you read the README, it'll tell you about these different variables here. So for example, if you don't want to use Fedora, you can I thought there was just a don't use Fedora variable here. This Fedora 6, I think, is what changes, it makes the determination whether you want Fedora 5 or Fedora 6. But anyway, there's a bunch of these variables where you can adjust things here, and what you do here in this file determines the output of this Docker Compose file. So this Docker Compose gets created from all of these little Docker Compose fragments that that are then sort of like called for in this project, in the sample.env file rather. Yeah.
Noah,
So
did
for
you see you
example,
have a question in the chat? I'm sorry to interrupt.
no, I didn't see that. Seth, so if you want to import a site database export as part of this, so what if you want to import a site database export as part of this spin up process? Yeah, so I think the README covers that. The way, like conceptually, what you would do there is you would clone your Git repository into the code base, and you would you don't want to run a site install, right? So really what you want to do, I think the order of operations here is like make hydrate, which like brings the system up, like creates a Solr core and the other extra things that the infrastructure needs. And then you would want to use the database, Drupal database import. So you'd run make Drupal database import, and you'd give it a file name, and it would import that into your Drupal database. And then you'd have your Drupal code base in the code base folder, and you'd have the database loaded into the database, and hopefully Hydrate would have taken care of all of the other little components. We can look at Hydrate. Yeah, so you can see it makes Solr cores, namespaces, that's BlazeGraph, I think, and then it runs the Islandora migrations. And it ultimately will do a Drush CR when it's done. Yeah, so right, making local will create a new site from like a starter kit, essentially. You could do that, and then you could do a database import from there. But you know, your Fedora may have terms ingested into it that that came from the other site install. So yeah, it's much cleaner to do a make hydrate and then do the database import sort of atomically. I think Nigel covered that well in the README. Let's go see. Yeah, there are some other aspects here. So for example, if you want to build a site, if you want to build a database from a code base with no database, you can do that because of Drupal's config export, right? So if your code base includes a good config export, there's actually a flag in that sample.env file, which will import all of the configs in the config folder rather than try to create a, rather than just load a database. And the end result should be relatively similar. The main difference there is the config import can never bring content over. So you're not going to get taxonomy terms or something like that. You have to have a different way of getting taxonomy terms and other content nodes into the site. We looked at the secret folder also. We talked about these. Oh yeah, and content ID. Yeah, old themes have content ID references. Yeah, that in that case, then you're going to have to bring over the exact database, and that's fine. There are other config management make file commands, UUID. If you're bringing over a site that you built elsewhere, or if your code base doesn't necessarily match the database that you have for one reason or another, there is a make set site UUID, which will fix that UUID mismatch problem for you. Nigel wrote a nice little function that runs inside of Drupal that handles all of that. So there's a lot of little goodies like that packed in here. But yeah, and I'll share the slides here at the end of this. You're welcome to use this as a reference. I would say make demo is the simplest thing. That'll get you a version of the future.islandora.ca. If you're on the site install branch or install profile branch rather, you can get the Born Digital Lyrasis install profile, which you'll see in a minute. And you can start exploring those imports and exports that we were just looking at. Make up turns things on, make down turns things off, and make clean blows everything up, like everything. So to only run that when you really want to throw everything out and start over. And what it does is in plain text. So if you want to understand what it does before you run it, make clean. First of all, it sort of gives a GUI confirmation on the command line. Then it does the down that turns all your containers off. Then it RMs your code base, your certs folder, your secrets live subfolder, and then it tries and throws out like git work in progress. The first thing I did when I forked this repository was comment out this line because I hate it when it throws out what I'm working on. But you might like it when it throws out what you're working on. Yeah, RM star. Yeah. Nigel did not hide that in here. Okay, we talked about maintenance a little bit. As I said, I really propose that we spend a good 60 or 90 minutes talking about that at another time. And we also touched on this also. There are really two things that you have to consider to run ISLE in production. One is SSL. You need to handle certs well. And all the tooling is there. You just have to get your cert in the right place and everything will get picked up. And the second thing is, for best practices, you really shouldn't be treating your remote servers as if they're a local with bind mounts. You should be when I say bind mount, I mean you shouldn't be bind mounting your entire code base, right? That's sort of it's fine, it gets the job done, but it's not recommended best practice. Recommended best practice is actually to bind mount only the public and private files directories, because that's fundamentally what you're persisting between turning the Docker containers on and off. And then I expect that other command is actually done by now, but to touch on Kubernetes one last time, if you're doing ISLE already and you're thinking you want to sort of step it up a notch and do auto scaling and other things that Kubernetes offers, the Quirk project, which we've been involved with, recently open sourced their Quirk base i8 project, and one of the components here is something called a Helm chart. This folder and the files that contain are essentially the Kubernetes version or the Helm version for Kubernetes of what you saw in the Docker Compose file. So all of those services are like restated in this, in the not that one, in the files here. So if we go into services, for example, you'll see this is the Cantaloupe service, the IIIF service. Here's the Crayfit service, FC repo, etc. And then there's more things in here. that you'll recognize if you're just comparing what's in that Docker Compose file to what is in this Helm chart. So I'm not going to attempt to walk through everything here. If you're interested, this is now open and you are welcome to go check it out. There are other ways that institutions are handling Kubernetes. So I know that Johns Hopkins sort of is handling things in a different way. And I think Lyrasis ended up handling things in a different way. But we in Quark are relying on this Helm chart here, and we're using GitLab CI to manage all of the orchestration behind the scenes. All right, so let's go check in on that install over here. Yep, it is done, and it left us with a login link. So let's just go and pop that open. Okay, and I'm not even going to bother changing the password. But I know there are 4 things I have to do here. One thing is I'm going to make a homepage piece of content. Add content basic page. Second thing is add a browse collections page. Can we get the link to the Helm chart? Yes. The link to the Helm chart is in the slides, but I don't think I've shared that yet. So let me see. Helm chart. Here we go. If I can find the chat window. Maybe I should do the slides while I'm at it. Those are the slides. All right, where were we? We built the browse collections page, and then we have to go resave to taxonomy terms, irritatingly. Models, resource types, collection. Save.
Is what you're doing now just because there's some sort of wrinkle or bug?
Yeah, there's a sort of order of operate. Okay, so I don't know why the taxonomy terms need to be resaved, but Drupal throws an error about translatable content, which is kind of ridiculous if you don't resave those. So I think there's probably a way that we can tweak the way the terms get put in so that whatever data is missing is there, and you don't have to do this. That's on my list. And sometime in the next 4 weeks or so, we're going to do a big giant overhaul on this whole thing, and Danny will update that amongst other things. So that's what those 2 are. These first 2 are automatable, and they're actually the automation is actually in this this guy here. Essentially uses the JSON API and that password, which we have available to us on the file system, to go and create the homepage and browse collections. But for whatever reason, I'm getting a 403 on those, and so they're not created. So that's another thing we have to just fix. But very soon this will just happen. Like the 2 pages that I created will just come out of the box as part of the install profile. So having done that, I think we can go to the home page, and we can actually, let's go ahead and create a repository item. Test collection. Save. Now we're going to, all right, this, going to add child, repository item, test image. Image, why don't we do a TIFF? We'll do media, add media, file, choose file, large image. Original file. We're looking at this image before the derivatives are finished generating. So we might have to reload this in a second. We can go look at the media. Oh, there it was loading. So yeah, so you could see the fits file is here. The service file and thumbnail got generated. OCR should come in. Actually, probably the OCR is not going to show up on this. If we ingested a PDF, OCR would show up. So the reason that I went and resaved those collections taxonomy terms was to fix the layout on this, and the layout on this is broken. It should be displaying like this. So I thought that those saving those two terms fixed that, but maybe I only saved one of them. Oh, no, I did save both of them. So I don't know what's up with that. I'll have to look, but anyway, that's an issue. That's the only reason I did that, was to fix the layout on this collection, which is there's a broken context. The context is asking for those terms, and there's something in Drupal that's failing to hand that term off. And when I did this last night, that did it. But anyway, so this is the theme that we and Lyris has contributed. That's fundamentally an Islandora 7 sort of parody theme. It's WCAG 2.1 AA compliant, and it does essentially what Islandora 7 does in terms of user experience for navigating objects.
Noah,
Yeah.
is the theme on that branch as part of the profile? Do you get the theme and a
That's
general
right.
metadata setup?
Yeah. Yes. So, and the theme, all right, let's go look at that. So there are two themes here. There is the Islandora starter theme, and there is the Islandora base theme. This image needs to be replaced. Islandora base theme is sort of the parent theme for all of this, and you're not expected to modify that. That is something that the Islandora Foundation will release minor tweaks to here and there. But really, this Islandora starter theme is the one that it puts in place for you to use, and then you get all of these modification, customization tools right here. You can set the logo image. You can change fonts, you can change colors. We'll just do a color change here to we'll go to the, no, the Carapace thing is going to look terrible. We'll go with dark. I think this just goes with a black and white sort of theme. I'll hit save. I didn't like the logo. Oh, I unchecked this box, that's why. Okay, now if I go to the, we'll clear all the caches. And then from this point, it's just a Drupal application, right? It's a Drupal application that includes Islandora defaults and Islandora modules and whatnot, and you can customize how things look and feel and behave from here. So for example, if we go to that browse collections page that we created, I think it'll give us a list of all of the collections. So this is a predefined view on the page called browse collections. It will show you a list of all the collections. And what we do is we put this in the main navigation. So that should probably be a third step after that content is created in that initial content. But there is support in here for newspapers in this theme and for compound objects. Compound objects display essentially as slideshows. I can do a little demo of that if folks are interested.
That is, in my mind, huge. Because I think outside of this, there's no way to deal with compound objects. At least quasi out of the box.
That is maybe true.
Do you mind, Noah, just given the time, if we start asking you some questions? I mean, I think folks have felt comfortable doing that throughout, but do you mind just in general if whatever
Yep,
comes up?
absolutely. Yep.
Great.
How is a compound object different from paged content?
Okay, just a second, and I will bring that. I just want to make sure. I didn't think there was a compound in both the system model and the resource type, and I want to make sure I get it right, which one it is. Edit.
This is really great to see this in action, because I know we were talking about this particular PR last week at the tech meeting. So it's nice to see a demo of it.
Absolutely. Looks like it is. Compound object is supposed to be the system model. And the resource type is collection. Okay. So to answer the question, resource type is collection. To answer the question, fundamentally, in our view anyway, collections, compound objects, and page content are special cases of collections, right? They're umbrella objects, right?
Okay.
Containers. And so the difference between collections proper and compound objects is really in those two values I just set. It is a collection of a resource type, but down here at the bottom, when you set the system model, you set set that to compound, and what that's going to do is be interpreted by the context module to have a different display for the object. So let's just go add a couple of children here and see if it behaves itself, or if the compound context has the same problem that the collection context has. Still image. Image. Media. Then I should turn off this terribly ugly color scheme that I set. Yes, that's image. Okay. So this is just an image. Add a second child. Image. We'll throw this one in OpenSea Dragon also. And compound child to media. And we're going to add media, image, choose, I think I saw Gavin's duck here. Original file, save. Okay, so now let's go back out and browse back into that object. So compound example. And what we'll give it a minute, see if this one's behaving better. Okay, so yeah, you can see it's sort of it handles it as a slideshow, right? It's really a collection, but the view mode that we're providing here with the context module is because we set the model as a compound object, then the display of it is as a compound object. And there is both item description and set description. So you can do a metadata toggle between the parent metadata and the child metadata.
Okay.
And I hate this color scheme so much, I have to go fix it.
So can you explain why that would be more suited to newspapers, that display?
Newspapers. Okay, so let's go do a newspaper separately. Newspapers.
Maybe I've got that wrong. Am I wrong about that? Is it not, is this, are you saying this display is not,
No, there's another
ahead.
newspaper content type. So let's go look at that for a second.
Okay.
I'm going to need to double check something here. Just a second.
Katie, is your question more about like when would you choose to use a compound object? Like what would you?
Yeah,
sort
I
of-
mean, sort of like, yeah, I guess that's right. Yes.
Mhm.
But I'm curious about the
Okay.
newspapers too.
So this is This is like New York Times.
Right.
This is the top level newspaper object. So here we're going to again say it's a collection because it fundamentally is. It's a collection of issues, if you want to think of it that way. But here we're going to say newspaper. So again, this is going to change the view that you get of the collection of the objects. And
Can
I'm
you
not
just
going to
press on
set a
model
display.
again?
Yeah.
Can you press on model again so I can see those choices?
So I think we added compound object and newspaper here.
Interesting.
And you saw me be surprised before the compound object was under system resource. I don't think it is supposed to be. I think it's just supposed to be here.
Okay.
So that's a thing that probably needs to be tweaked.
There's a question in chat about if the compound object feature is part of Islandora defaults or part of the profile theme.
I believe we contributed that already to Islandora defaults and it was accepted. So I believe the answer is it's in Islandora defaults now. But outside of this install profile, there's not views to handle that in a nice way. Like there's not a view that displays it differently from something else. So let's go ahead and add a child here. And I'm going to just make sure I do this right. All right. We are now going to create a newspaper issue. And
So like the October 26th issue of the New York Times.
Yeah, let's
Okay.
name it that instead. Something, right? I don't know when the issue is that I have.
Right. Whatever. Yeah.
So I chose collection at the top again, because really it's a collection of pages, the way it's set up. But here I get to choose, I'm actually going to choose publication issue. not newspaper, right? The newspaper was for the parent. This one is a publication issue.
Mhm, mm.
So I'm gonna hit save, and then let me see what type of object I have attached to this one.
So this
Your
has
turn.
model sort of refining resource type in a way. No, I
This
think I might have that wrong.
Yeah, they have to be used in conjunction and they're separate. And my metadata expertise does not go to the level of really carrying that conversation. I think I saw Christina on this call and we had some back and forth as we were getting to the final orchestration of where those things went and how they work together. So Christina, if you're around, do you want to speak to that?
I vaguely remember that. That was a really long time ago. My recollection is that it was pulling from initially it was this refinement piece was pulling out of something that would be in the descriptive metadata, typically, like physical form or something like that, that isn't always set and isn't mandatory. It's not required. So I think I threw up a flag saying this cannot be set on a field that's in the descriptive metadata that metadata librarians are used to being able to decide what to do with. If it's sort of like required system functionality stuff, that needs to be in a different field. So I think that is why it got moved to model, which I think is a better place for it, because model is more about how Islandora treats a thing, not how you want to describe the thing in your descriptive metadata.
Here, I'm just going to pop into our demo and grab actual newspaper pages and then we can populate this object. Or, if you, let's see. So this is what it's going to look like when we're all done, but we'll just go and steal the newspaper pages from this object. Media, oops, children. Download. Okay. All right, and then we can try, we'll go back here. Choose files. Okay, Danny showed me this. I had no idea it existed. We'll see if it works within our theme. CT, these ones. Open. Content type, repository item. Now for these pages, we're going to set resource type text and model page, resource type. Model page, here it is. Oh. Okay, so this is the problem. We're gonna have to go fix those separately in a minute, but we can do this bulk upload. PDF, I guess that's a file. And we're gonna go original file, submit. It may fail because resource type is a required field and it's not on that bulk upload form. Huh. It sort of worked. Let's go.
And
look
I
at
think
that.
that's the thing we removed. Maybe that was it, resource type or something that was in the no, there you.
Yeah, it's just not part of that bulk upload form. Danny built that before this profile came along, and we just need to tweak that form to include the resource type as one of the pull downs, so it can be bulk set like that. And then this will be super fast for uploading bulk pages. Text. Save. Resource type, text. Save. All right, now let's come back out to here. We're gonna go back to test collection. Oh wait, this layout's not working for us. We'll go to search. Here we have New York Times. New York Times has, hey. No, that layout's not working either. Must be the same compound. I mean, sorry, the same context issue.
I believe it relies on the date ETDF date field for that to work.
Ah, all right. So I guess that was a thing we needed to set on this object. Date created, like, what did I say? 2021, 10/26. Is that valid?
Might want to put it in date issued instead if it assumes they're published. I don't know if it got that picky or not, but
Oh, did I do the wrong one?
I
can
don't
go
know if it
look.
matters, but I'd opt for date issued instead of date created in case it mattered.
All right, let's take a look and see. Whoops. Edit.
The only reason I know is because I was poking at this just a few weeks ago.
I'm going to put it, I'll put it in both, but we'll change the date and we'll see which one does the thing. Save. Okay, so we can go back now to New York Times and let's see, 2021, October. Okay, so whoever suggested date issued was correct, it looks like. Date issued. And maybe this is not even necessary.
Also note that this relies on a formatter that's currently just on the theme. So if you wanted to have your own theme that's completely separate from this one, you'd have to bring over the code for that formatter as well.
Yep. Yeah, and that sentence right there highlights the difficulties we're all going to have sharing configuration in Alundra 8. Because it's true, and I don't have an answer.
You can contribute the formatter to the controlled access terms module.
Yeah, bundling things like that into modules probably is the correct way to distribute it most broadly.
And I think
Basically,
like,
just to
if-
summarize,
sorry,
you go ahead, Christina.
like if you had created a date published field in your content model for repository item instead of date issued, does it break? Because that's
Think-
another part where
Sure.
we're all reinventing wheels and it's going to make things hard if they depend upon specific fields.
Well, to illustrate Seth's point, so if I go here and I edit this, oops, this is a view, right? And if I edit this view, are we going to be able to see it here? Date issued. See, the view, which comes along with our theme, uses date issued. And if you wanted to change the behavior, you could just come in here and change that. Or if you wanted to build a view that worked almost like this or exactly like this, you could edit this view, like look at it and then copy it over, like create one on another site that matched it. Or there's an export thing here somewhere, right?
But it just highlights like the additional complexity of trying to drop something like this view into your setup if you already
Right.
have your setup and you named it date published instead of date issued. Like there's more things to be aware of that you need to configure than,
Right.
you know, the situation if we sort of assumed we were using mods and it has date issued. So we all had date issued.
Right.
And that's not the case anymore.
Great. I haven't been paying attention to comments. Looks like other folks are bringing things up. Did I miss any questions? Yes,
don't
it's recorded.
think So,
Okay.
I was also going to suggest that we actually stop the recording because it's been 2 hours and we're moving into the where we have moved through the Q&A time into the time that was allotted for a break. If you're fine with this, I'll just hit stop.
Yep, absolutely. Thank you.